Today I want to talk about white color in watercolor. At first it may seem very simple. If I need something white, I just take white paint and paint it. But in watercolor it works a little differently. Watercolor is a transparent medium. And one of the most beautiful qualities of watercolor is exactly this transparency. When we apply watercolor to paper, the light passes through the thin layer of pigment, reflects from the white paper underneath, and comes back to our eyes. This is what creates that fresh, glowing watercolor effect. So when we talk about the white in watercolor, the most beautiful white is usually not white paint. The most beautiful white in watercolor is the paper itself. This means that we simply don't paint over the areas that need to stay white. It can be a highlight on cherry, foam on the sea, a bright part of a cloud, a water drop, or maybe snow. And there are several ways to work with white areas in watercolor. The first one is the simplest one. Just leave the paper unpainted. For example, in this painting with cherries, I leave small white areas for the highlights. I don't add white paint there. I simply understand in advance where the light should be, and I paint it around those areas with my brush. Of course, this makes the process a little bit more difficult, because before you start painting, you need to think about where the highlights area will be. Anyway, this is very important watercolor skill. Watercolor is not acrylic or oil. We cannot cover everything again and again with thick layers and fix everything 10 times on top. Of course, something can be softened, some pigment can be lifted, some mistake can be adjusted. But in general, watercolor asks us to think a little ahead. Where will the light be? Where will the shadow be? Which part should stay almost untouched? So the first method is to preserve the white of the paper. I just don't paint over it. This is the cleanest, brightest and most watercolor looking white. The second way is to use masking fluid. Masking fluid helps us protect areas that should stay white before we start painting with watercolor. For example, I used this method in my ocean foam lesson. Before painting the water, the shadows, and the movement of the waves, I covered the areas of foam with masking fluid. Then I painted over everything with watercolor, and then the paint was completely dry, I removed the masking fluid. Underneath, the paper stayed clean and white. This method is very useful when we have many small white details. For example, sea foam, tiny highlights, small dots or lights, thin lines, snow or complicated white shade that would be difficult to paint around with a brush. But masking fluid has also its own rules. You need to apply it to dry paper. The watercolor layer over it also needs to be completely dry before you remove it. And it is better not to leave masking fluid on the paper for too long, especially if the paper surface is delicate. So it is very useful tool, but it should be used carefully. The third way is to lift the pigment. This means that if an area has already been painted, we can try to make it lighter again. we can take a clean damp brush, gently wet the area and lift some of the pigment with a paper towel or tissue. Sometimes this can be done while the paint is still wet. For example, when I paint clouds, I can lift the pigment from the wet wash and create soft, light shapes. And sometimes I leave the pigment after the layer is already dry. In this case, I gently wet the area again and remove part of the color. This method can be very useful. But it is important to understand that we usually cannot return all the way back to perfectly white paper, especially if the pigment has stained the paper or the color was very strong. We can make area lighter, sometimes much lighter, but it will not be the same clean white as untouched paper. Still, this method is very helpful. For example, if you accidentally painted over a highlight, you can try to lift some pigment from that place. And after that, if you need to, you can add white pigment on top. So this can also be combined method. First, we leave the color as much as possible, and then we add a small white accent if we need it. The fourth way is to add white paint at the end. For example, you can use Chinese white, titanium white. I heard people used white gouache. When I was a child, I used gouache a lot, and with gouache, everything felt simple. If I needed white, I just took white paint and use it like you do it in acrylic or in oil. But when I started to learn watercolor, I learned a very different rules. I don't use white, don't use black. Try to leave the paper white where you need white. And try to mix your dark color instead of taking black directly. Of course, later you realize that this rule is not absolute. There are situations where the white paint can be useful. There are situations where black can also be used. But as a beginner rule, it really helps you understand watercolor better. Because watercolor is not about covering the paper with paint. It's about working with light, transparency, and the white of the paper underneath. Leave me a comment if you have any, and I will answer your questions in the next videos. Using the white paint is not my favorite method. If we are talking about the cleanest watercolor white, because the white paint doesn't glow the same way as untouched paper. It sits on top of the watercolor layers and looks more oracle. But sometimes this is exactly what we need. For example, if we are painting splashes on a waterfall, or small dots of the sea foam, or tiny bright accent that would be almost impossible to preserve from the beginning. In these cases, white paint can look very beautiful. The important thing is to apply it only on completely dry paper. If the paper is still wet, the white paint can mix with the lower layer, become muddy, or spread it in a way you don't want. And again, if you already painted over an area with dark watercolor, white paint will not always bring it back to the color of clean paper. It can make it lighter, it can create bright accent, but it will be the different kind of white. Not as transparent, not as glowing, and not as fresh as preserved paper. So we have 4 main ways to work with white in watercolor. First, leave the paper unpainted. Second, use masking fluid. Third, leave the pigment. And fourth, add white paint at the end. There is no one perfect method for every situation. It depends on what you're painting. If you need the cleanest and brightest white, I try to preserve the paper from the beginning. If I need many small white details, I may use masking fluid. If I accidentally paint over the light areas, or if I want to create soft clouds or drops, I can leave some pigment. And if I need final small accents, splashes, or little corrections, it can be used white paint at the end. I think the best way to understand those methods is try all of them. You can make small exercises. Paint 3 simple cherries, 3 clouds, 3 drops, or 3 little waves. If the first version, leave white areas from the beginning. In the second version, use masking fluid. In the third version, try to leave the pigment. And in the fourth version, add white paint at the end. Then compare the results. Where does the white look the freshest? Which method feels easiest for you? Which one gives the effect you need? Many of the full lessons I'm showing in this video are available on my Patreon. The cherry lesson is there. The ocean form lesson with masking fluid is also there. The main thing I want you to remember this. In watercolor, white is not always white paint. Very often white in watercolor is the light we save on the paper from the very beginning.